My computer just turned 1 o'clock, so I would like to call this meeting to order and read a quick statement. The Commission on Equitable Housing and Development meeting has now commenced. It is April 28th, 2022, and it is 1 o'clock. This meeting is being held virtually due to COVID-19 to allow for social distancing and protect the public health. As we continue our efforts in meeting remotely, we ask all commissioners and guests to mute yourselves until called upon to speak to avoid feedback and background noise. For those who have dialed in using the call-in number, to unmute to speak, dial *6 on your phone. Also, prior to speaking, please announce who you are to identify yourself. As a reminder, this meeting is being recorded. We ask that you only use the chat function to request to speak or to announce that you are leaving the meeting so that we can track quorum. Also, in order to comply with the state open meeting law, attendance and votes will be done by way of roll call using audio, not by using the chat function. And with that, I will jump into our agenda for the day. Welcome, everybody. Hope everybody is doing well. The second item on our agenda today is the review and adoption of the March 22nd meeting minutes. Mike, I guess that's up to the two of us. Do you have any issues or concerns, or can we approve those meeting minutes?
I say we approve them. I just don't have them in front of me, but I don't remember a problem with them. I just need to pull them up. So I move that we approve.
All right, approved. Item number 3, subcommittee purpose, goals, and membership. This is our main agenda item, I think, where we can get into some topics regarding housing segregation and other things that other equity topics that we want to talk about. So just as a review, I think where we are basically as the Housing Segregation Subcommittee is we brought to the full commission the idea of doing a study or something similar to establish a baseline around equity and kind of where we are as a city, and so that we can have kind of a common framework and jumping off point to actually address the equity issues that do exist in the community. So I don't have a ton really on my list of things to discuss today. I mean, I think one of the things we could discuss is kind of where we go from here as the Housing Segregation Subcommittee. I think we put a relatively meaty ask on the table of the full commission, and I know that we're going to discuss that as a full commission at our next meeting. So I don't know, Mike or Joe, do y'all have any? Oh, here comes Vicky. We'll let her get on here real quick. Hey, Vicky.
Hello.
Thanks for joining us. We have done the first 2 items on the agenda, the call to order and adopted the meeting minutes, and we are on to number 3, which is really our kind of meaty action item where we can kind of talk about, equity topics and housing segregation and kind of the things that we're wanting to take action on. So just to get you caught up.
I was waiting for a while. I wasn't late.
Oh.
Just so you know, I don't know who the host is, but
my bad. I apologize.
Sorry about that, Vicky. Glad to have you on now. Luckily, you missed the most boring parts of the meeting. So anyway, I was just saying, Vicky, to catch you up. I literally had just been talking for a second here, but where I think we are as the subcommittee right now is, we took back to the full commission the idea of doing a much deeper study on equity and fair housing, segregation, that kind of thing, to help the committee, the full committee or full commission, really establish a baseline about where we are in terms of equity as a city up to this point. And I think the idea that we have had is that we don't really have a great baseline. We don't really have a great foundation with which to build going forward. And it's kind of hard to address equity issues if we haven't really clearly established what they are. I think we all kind of know in our minds to a certain extent that there are issues, but digging more deeply and on a more granular level, I think is kind of what we're asking of the full commission to at least undertake and discuss. And with that, I'm not sure exactly where we want to go today. As a subcommittee, what do we want to do in the meantime while, at the next meeting, the full commission is going to discuss the proposal that we put on the table. So yeah, I don't know if anybody has any thoughts about anything that we kind of need to do today to bolster the conversation or do anything with that for the next commission meeting about our proposal, or potentially where we go from here as that kind of gets hashed out, and what our role and potential action could or should be for us going forward. So with that, I'll just kind of open it up to the group and see if anybody has any thoughts.
I do have a query, and it's to one particular individual, because this, in my view, is sometimes it's kind of looking like from the outside in, and I think it's not a bad view. Joe. Yeah, I just, I like to hear your views sometimes, because you're able to see, I think, a bigger picture.
Well, thanks for saying so, Mike. I appreciate that. I think I understand what Jay's getting at, and the two things I've kind of been thinking about are, yeah, if we ask for a study, what we probably don't want is this group to just say, all right, we're sitting on our hands until that study comes back. So like Jay says, we kind of know that a lot of the things we hear about, both anecdotally and via data, happening in other places are probably happening here too, whether it's steering or appraisal bias or lending discrimination. And what a study would probably show us is the depth and the impacts to our local community. In the meantime, what do we do though? I think the next step for me is like, okay, if we're going to look at what those impacts and the depth of those issues are, what are the solutions that other communities are also proposing to those problems? And maybe we can start talking about those so that when we have a study, we can go, okay, this is a really big problem and we need to prioritize the solutions for this part of our segregation issues. That's one part of it. The other thing that's been on my mind lately, and this is, Jay, I think you were at a couple of the recent affordable housing subcommittee meetings, and I was frustrated in a couple of those because, I really didn't think I was talking about anything that was completely off the wall, but I quoted statistics from our Poverty and Urban Stress Report and MAP dashboard, right? And MAP dashboard was like presented to Mayor and Council, what, a year and a half, 2 years ago? I felt like this was pretty recent stuff, and I'm quoting it directly. And what happened in that meeting was that immediately somebody who happens to be a developer said, you're wrong, that's old data, we can't use it. I have proprietary data that's newer, and it's about tightness in the housing market. We looked at a vacancy rate. And I feel like immediately there was no critical analysis from that subcommittee about whether the data we had and had been working off of was still valid, whether we should still be using that. So I came back the next month and said, hey, I'm open to using different data, but I think we need to all be open to that. But I kind of want to know more. And now I'm really apprehensive when we talk about getting more data and getting a survey about everything. If we're going to go into the work of having that done, and we're all going to get behind that, and then a year and a half later, somebody's going to say, that's an old issue, and I don't think we need to prioritize that anymore, because that will drive me. Like I was already about the affordable housing and the data that we were talking about there, kind of frustrated, a little bit exasperated. if somebody does that with housing segregation data, like that's going to drive me up a wall. So I don't know how to also get buy-in so that when we have the data, we can use that and say, these are persistent issues and we can't throw out this stuff after a couple of years and stop working on these issues. So those are the two parts of kind of what is coming next for housing segregation and for the commission as a whole that have been on my mind. Thanks for asking, Mike.
Well, I wanted to because I want to admit to the subcommittee real quick that like for the past few days, maybe weeks, I got a little bit of tunnel vision, so I'm trying to be careful to make sure that my mind is just headed in one direction. For what it's worth, Joe, when I heard of data that was like a year old, for the most part, being a data guy, I like data. I was like, okay, I was okay with it. However, the way things have been going with housing just in general, the past year, 2 years, and things change so quickly. I hate to keep doing survey after survey or research after research, but it's been changing so fast, it's scary to me. So that's the one thing. Yeah, before I tell you all what's been on my mind a while, let's stay on this. Go ahead, Jay. How you feel?
Vicky, go ahead.
Well, I don't want to get off topic, but I have to be honest, I'm struggling with the whole topic of equity and this subcommittee and the committee in general. And of course, I'm going to get to disability issues and Jay won't be surprised, but I know that housing is the focus, but there are a lot of issues intersecting that. And I struggle to see a commitment on those. And so it's taken a while and some of them are getting resolved, but not all. I'll give you an example. I've had to advocate for and push and give multiple reminders to even having the live transcriptioning turned on for meetings, which I rely on. And I told somebody recently, I'm like, if they forget one more time, I'm going to start formally requesting CART, and it'll cost the city money. And usually I'm okay with the live transcription. Now, if I had a hearing disability, it wouldn't work because it's not always accurate. But with my disability, it does help tremendously. And as long as people speak clearly and speak loud enough, it's usually okay. And I do want to recognize, thank you, Ernesto. We have that resolved for like ongoing meetings. And I was reading the minutes for this last meeting, and I will tell you right now, if I was helping a participant who wanted to file an ADA complaint or lawsuit against the city, I'd use those minutes as an example, because I can't even believe it's in print. And I remember us talking about it, and it basically says the city isn't going to follow accessibility guidelines just when they can. That is absolutely reprehensible to me. I'm appalled. I was appalled by the discussion we had, and even more appalled now to see it in writing that it's actually documented that way. And so I'm really struggling with this. And I'll tell you now that the city's website in general has major accessibility issues, and we just tackle it department by department, a page at a time. But here it is, the Commission on Equitable Housing, and it's like, no, we have this tunnel vision. It's all about housing, but we're not going to look at all of these other issues. And yeah, we realize that disabled people are involved and accessibility is an issue, so we'll just tackle it when we can, when it fits us and it's easy for us. That's really a problem for me. and I'm sorry, I probably sound angry because I am. It really upsets me, and I don't know how to kind of commit to this work with that. So I'm just, I guess, telling you how I feel about it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Vicky. And I think, you're highlighting an aspect of this process and discussing equity and our commission as a whole of, I think you're highlighting a specific thing for specific folks that can be done now and should be done now to make, generally speaking, things more equitable, for lack of a better way to put it. And obviously, if we're talking about, equity and we're talking about larger housing policies and development policies, that's one thing. But the other part of that equation is exactly what you're talking about, is making things accessible for people now, making things equitable for people now. And I think it goes to show just kind of where we are, generally speaking, as a city on many different levels regarding equity and accessibility. So I certainly understand your anger, and frankly, the way that you put that makes me angry as well. And I'm glad that you're bringing that up. I guess one of my follow-up questions would be, what next? I mean, this is clearly an issue, and I do think it's something that needs to be resolved. So what do we do? Either as a subcommittee. I mean, one of the things we could do as a subcommittee is just, again, as an action item, bring this forward, citing a couple of your particular examples, and just shining a light on it. Generally speaking, the idea of accessibility and equity starts with us in our meetings, and the things that the city is putting out. So I guess my question is, Vicky, what if anything do you think this subcommittee could and should do around this topic, what you're talking about?
I mean, I don't really know what power the subcommittee has, but like I said, I'm just frankly pissed about what came out of that meeting, where it's like, yeah, we'll make maps or do it, alternate formats, when we can. I'm appalled, and I don't have the time to follow up on that. But if I'm telling you, as a center, we do help people with ADA complaints and lawsuits. And if somebody was having trouble, like, yeah, we would have to help them. And maybe I need my tech guy to really run a full analysis on the website to show in black and white all of the things wrong, because it's not just one page, it's everywhere. And then everything that comes out, when Jay, recently, I copied you on it, we got it resolved, but I'm like, okay, Jay and Liz are featured speakers on something about fair housing. Fair housing also deals with people with disabilities, and the materials the city put out are completely inaccessible to people with visual disabilities. I'm like, what? There's just some basic stuff, and I feel like I really don't know what the focus is, and I've offered help. And I will say, I think I took it to Ernesto and whoever was involved in designing it. She did convert it to a PDF, which wasn't accessible. And so we went back and forth, and I ended up meeting with her and giving her stuff. So hopefully that will get better. I guess it's just sad that nobody seems to be looking at the big picture in advance, and I know, my focus obviously is people with disabilities, but we deal, our participants are disabled, but there are also a lot of racial minorities and, all walks of life, and a lot of people with low income. And I also see a lot of things where nothing's written in plain language, and I just feel like there's some general guidelines that, in terms of, even when it's time to put information out about housing, to make things, truly accessible and more equitable, you have to look at all the people that need that information, and how do you present it in a way that they can understand it. You know, even in terms of like housing that could be available, we help people all the time because they can't navigate the city's website and information. It's too overwhelming. They don't understand it. Half the time staff looks at it and it's like, wait, what does that really mean? You know? So I don't know, Jay, I don't know what the answer is, but I feel like stepping back, I guess if we're waiting for a study, I don't, that might be outside the scope of this committee, but I just feel like there's a lot of stuff happening that doesn't fit with what I see as the sort of vision for what the whole committee is doing.
Yeah.
And I feel like I fight these issues every day, not just with the city, but I think it makes it more aggravating when it's coming out of the Commission for Equitable Housing, you know? So I don't know.
Well, I mean, I guess, again, listening to you talk about this, I mean, one of the things I think that we could very easily do is, I see your hand, Mike, very easily do as a subcommittee is just bring to the full commission's attention that, you know, we've got to practice what we preach, and there are accessibility issues with the work that we're doing as far as it goes for persons with disabilities. I mean, that's one piece. And I think, Vicki, what you're also talking about goes to an even larger issue that has to do with equity and starts with our work as a commission when we get together and produce materials and whatever, but also just to inform our work. And that's participation, broadly speaking, right? I mean, you know, there's very little participation from the public and, you know, theoretically affected communities regarding the work that we're doing. And I know that we're, you know, as a commission still, I think, relatively a young commission and trying to get our legs under us and, you know, be able to figure out what it is we want to do. But, you know, I think that that's a critical piece as well, just trying to elicit, and not just elicit, but actually make public participation happen, right? I mean, you can ask for it, and then you can actually go out and be proactive about getting it. Again, I think this to me goes into, you know, what is it are we actually doing as a commission? I mean, you know, do we have that kind of time, power, capacity? Not for the accessibility piece, because there's obviously a legal component there, but for the larger kind of issue of participation. So what I would propose that this subcommittee do and is just bring this to the attention of the full commission, kind of as you have framed it, Vicki, and also ask the question about larger participation and making that at least something that we need to think about and address. Does that sound like at least something that we could do proactively based on what you're bringing to the subcommittee's attention? Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Sure. And thanks for bringing it up. I really appreciate it. Mike.
Yeah, Vicki, for what it's worth, I think I've had some discussions about this particular subject with some people before, and I hope I'm not drawing you in uncomfortably. Laura, didn't we talk about this once before about a website or something that we were working on together or reviewing, and we had a discussion about accessibility issues, or at least concerns about accessibility that I had, maybe in regards to map and text and stuff like that? Did I have the conversation with you?
I mean, we've had this conversation in the subcommittee several times.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't remember about specifically, maybe you're thinking of the neighborhood ambassador project that we worked on,
Okay.
but I
Is
don't
it-
remember that
With
particular.
you and Laura and the presentation of the maps, and we did indeed have that conversation you're talking about. So I remember that as well. I think, Vicki, you were obviously there.
Yeah, and so I guess this is a good point for me to jump in. The last meeting, Allison and I had been doing research on, you know, what does how do we handle accessibility and maps? And so, you know, what we presented on, and Vicky wasn't there, unfortunately, was, you know, this is the result of what we found. And, you know, the main thing that we found was that this federal government website about, well, interactive maps happen to be one of the things that are very difficult to make accessible in ways other than presenting it in an alternate format. And so that's what, you know, that's what we ended up presenting.
That's not what the
And
minute says. So, or maybe it is, but basically the way I just read the minutes, and I'm looking at page 2, item 4B. Whenever possible, mapping applications will adhere to known accessibility considerations. There is nothing about providing an alternative. And so I don't know what you were looking at, but I'm going to tell you right now, if you put an interactive map and it is not fully accessible and you don't provide an alternative, you are in violation and not compliant.
it says, according to federal guidelines, live dynamic mapping applications are one example of where alternate versions of a web page should be given.
Well, so, and I think the larger point here, though, is, you know, obviously, and this is my opinion here, well, not my opinion, but, you know, federal law needs to be followed in terms of accessibility, whatever that is. I mean, that kind of goes without saying, but I also think that, you know, again, as a commission, the idea is that the information that we're providing to the public is accessible, and that should be the bar that we're shooting for. And you know, I think, Laura, it honestly, if I can speak honestly, I think it puts you and staff in a really tricky position where you guys are asked to do this mapping, and obviously it's really great work and it's really valuable. But the fact that there's not support for you guys above you, I mean, an expert or an ombudsman or something that's helping not just you, but anybody in the city who is, you know, like producing the flyers for the fair housing event that we had, or anything like that. You know, the fact that you guys are seemingly left on your own to kind of figure that out, I think is problematic and is really putting you in a tough spot to be, you know, trying to interpret federal law so that your maps, the maps that you're creating, are accessible. It obviously needs to be done. So, I mean, I think that that's a larger problem I see with the city. I mean, it needs to be done clearly if we're talking about, you know, creating a more equitable community. That's, and I think it goes to, you know, to take it to an even larger level, something that, you know, I was on a webinar today and have been thinking about as well, you know, in terms of, you know, we're talking about the idea of doing a deeper study. And clearly, I think there is a lot of question about what that would look like. But, you know, one of the things that I don't think that the city is doing is analyzing its current policies through an equity lens, right? I mean, we now have the chief equity officer. I know that person is new on the job, but like, you know, that's a place to start, right? What all of these federal dollars that are coming in for COVID relief and, you know, infrastructure and all of these things. I mean, to my knowledge, we haven't heard any discussion about, you know, whether or not the way that money is getting out to the community is being done in a more equitable way, or is, you know, addressing segregation as required under the Fair Housing Act. So, you know, again, I think this just goes to the whole point, in my opinion, of what we're talking about with this subcommittee, which is like, what are we doing about equity as a city right now? What are the things that have caused the city to be the inequitable place that it is, looking back historically? But again, like I said, you know, what is being done today to make sure that we're being proactive to use whatever funding is coming in from the federal government or wherever to make our communities more equitable? I mean, maybe it's happening, but again, you know, the fact that I think those of us on this commission can't really point to what those things are is problematic. And we need to have some sort of baseline again, where we're, okay, this is the situation regarding equity, so that then we can start to address those particular issues and you know, potentially provide some ideas for solutions and actions. So that's kind of where my head's at right now. Joe, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I thought it's before I, well, okay. Thinking about what you just said, Jay, one of the things I did this week was I went to the infill incentive district stakeholder meeting, right? And Ernesto was there for that. I've always been critical of the ID, and but that's a policy that we're looking at continuing, and we've shown that around that central business district area, there's been a lot of displacement. We know it's a gentrified area at this point, and we're looking at continuing that policy. And a lot of my feedback in that was, are we going to look at reforming this from the lens of equity, or are we just going to let this be a policy that continues displacing people and favors real estate speculation and capital investment and throw our hands up? You know, I think we've done with the last ID renewal and the central business district renewal. Coming back to the minutes, I think I read them in a little different way, that section 4B. When I read that, my thought was, okay, according to federal guidelines, where we've got live dynamic mapping applications, there's going to be an alternative version of a web page that should be given. And whenever possible, that mapping application will also adhere to the best practices for accessibility considerations for color, contrast, keyboard, navigation, and alt tags, etc. So that not only was the mapping part going to be as accessible as that could be made, but also there's going to be an alternate version of the web page for those for whom the accessibility concerns laid out in part 2 of that are insufficient. Is that, do I have a good understanding of that, Laura, or no?
That is what, yeah, that is what I presented, and that is what I wrote in the minutes, or that's what I was trying to express.
Okay, I gotcha. So it's not an either or kind of thing. We're going to do some accessibility concerns or an alternative site. Vicky, your hand's up again. Go. What's the feedback on the next part?
And I'm okay with providing the alternative. My issue is we were presented with this mapping quite a while back, and I've said from the beginning that it wasn't accessible, and it either needed to be fully accessible or there needed to be an alternative. I've now seen this mapping demonstrated multiple times and have yet to see the alternative.
We're still working on it. It's not going to be done until September.
And that's my point, though, that accessibility is not being considered from the beginning. It's an afterthought all the time. That's my issue. And I just wanted to say, and it goes outside of this committee and department, but Jay, you mentioned, like, you know, you feel for the staff and they don't have like a resource. Absolutely. It's a bigger issue because, so the city has to have an ADA coordinator under the ADA. Technically has a person that they put in documents is the ADA coordinator, but that is not the person's only role. He's not trained. It has no, I met him, and actually that department isn't very happy with me because we had to show them how the training that they were providing was completely outdated and not what's actually in the ADA. And this person is somebody who already worked there, and I guess they just decided to add the role on. Okay, so they can check a box and say the city has an ADA coordinator. He had no disability or ADA training when they gave him this role. And when we met with him, it's been many months now, but they said, oh, well, he is enrolled in the ADA coordinator training. And I asked a lot of questions. I'm like, really? You're going to be the city's ADA coordinator, and you have absolutely no background in disability or accessibility. And so that's an issue from the top down, because then what happens is every department with the city is supposed to have a staff member that's like a liaison then to that ADA coordinator. And I'm just telling you how big the problem is, because and so one of the examples I gave is, if you don't train people, so those like designated people within a department, all they're getting in terms of ADA training is this PowerPoint presentation that's full of legalese. They basically just took language from the ADA and plopped it into a PowerPoint. And so I tried to give them feedback. I'm like, so what happens, and it could happen in any department, including, housing, because the city has to follow multiple, Title I and Title II. And so one thing that comes up a lot, and there's been a lot of lawsuits over it, is you have an employee that has a disability, whether you know it or not. And so they come to you, your boss, and present some type of problem. Like I always use an example, like let's say we have a wheelchair user or somebody with a physical disability and tells their boss they're having difficulty using the copier or the printer or whatever equipment, and that piece of equipment is really central to their job. And we always ask when we do employer training, and employers get it wrong all the time, like, is that a request for a reasonable accommodation? And people say no. Under the law, it is. You have a disabled person identifying a barrier. And so we took these cases from actual EEOC cases and ADA cases. And so then we say, okay, 2 months later, the employee comes to you again and kind of presents the problem. And so the EEOC views that as, okay, that employee has now requested twice because they don't have to use the term reasonable accommodation or talk about their disability. Like, you have to at least start the process of exploring, that it's supposed to be an like what's going on. And so I use that. I'm like, if you don't train people on those nuances, you can have supervisors throughout the city who have no idea. Like that has come up in multiple lawsuits over and over again. And I know that's getting outside of this, but I just want to point out, Jay, how big the problem is with the city. It's not just, within this department. You're right. There isn't a source that has that information to guide departments or staff, which is why I'm, and the Arizona Center for Disability Law and Direct, we are constantly battling this. And like I said, not just with the city, we do it with the county and other places too, but it is much bigger. And I don't know what to do about that other than fight it daily.
Mike?
I was going to say, I think this concern relates to this commission in the terms of segregation, but also I think it's a bigger issue. And so my suggestion is we take this beyond this subcommittee, because I think it needs to be a bigger conversation, should have been a bigger conversation, really. And I feel like I'm somewhat informed about this issue because of where I live and the people I deal with daily. And I hope that that'll be accepted, because I'm constantly, have been for years now, concerned about people not getting access or the information, or if you want to use the word accommodation, that they need. And how do we make sure we don't leave somebody out? That's something I've been thinking about for years now, because it's been around me 24/7. So it is my view that this issue belongs in the lap of IT, so to speak, as far as information, because there are ways to make accommodations for people to participate and get information, whether depending on, regardless of various barriers, sight, sound, language, etc. There are technical solutions to this. So in my view, and my IT brethren may hate me on this, but that's for them to address. period. That's how I see it from a city standpoint in general. And that's where I think this topic should go.
Do you feel like we need a CHD, an item on one of those agendas that would be a discussion of general accessibility of HCD materials? Because I think that's kind of within the CHD. You know, talking about the entire city website probably is bigger than the Commission on Equitable Housing and Development, but at least for the HCD part of it and HCD resources, is that something we could do at a commission level?
I think we could do it from a subcommittee level, can't we, Jay? Like send up the, you know, like it's a warning flare. It's basically is what it is. A warning flare to the full commission, and the commission goes, okay, city, you know, this needs to be addressed. From again, I see it as from the top down, just city in general. It's the city's responsibility, I believe. And there may be rules and regulations and laws to back me up on that, maybe not, but that's how I see it.
Well, I think to your point, Mike, I mean, we as a subcommittee can kind of do whatever we want, right? I mean, how it lands with the full commission or, you know, outside of our subcommittee is another matter of which we can't necessarily control. But I do think it's perfectly reasonable for us if we, you know, have an issue that we want addressed or want action taken on, we can certainly take it to the full commission. And, you know, I guess my thought about this as well is, yes, I agree. Some of the stuff we're talking about is, you know, citywide and, you know, outside the purview of the Commission for Equitable Housing and Development. But, you know, I feel like if we're going to have a more equitable community, which is, you know, Commission for Equitable Housing and Development obviously is about, I think it really starts from within the city, because I do think that that is something that can be much more immediately controlled in terms of, you know, making things more accessible, more equitable, whatever that looks like. And again, it's using an equity lens from the inside out, right? I think it's hard to talk about equity and make a city more equitable from the outside of the city government if the city government and bureaucracy is not doing that internally as well. So I do think it's an important issue. And I think, frankly, it speaks to partly what my frustration is with the commission as a whole. I mean, I feel like we're not on the commission of affordable housing and equitable development. I mean, I understand that affordable housing is a huge piece of having an equitable community. So I am all for that, but we're spending a lot of time as a commission talking about affordable housing. And there are many more components to having an equitable community, equitable development than just housing. So I think that's also what I see our role kind of developing into, is being the voice of like, hey, don't forget about the equity piece. You can't just talk about affordable housing, have more housing be built, and then all of a sudden it's necessarily going to be equitable. So that's one of my main concerns as we kind of move forward as a commission. It's like, we're just like, oh, we got to get as much housing built as possible, as much affordable housing built as possible. But that's only a piece of the puzzle, particularly in my opinion, as a commission that's really looking at equity first, in my opinion. So Laura, I saw your hand up.
I was just gonna mention that the moment kind of passed, but I wanted to say that the web team at IT, I do know, are very concerned about accessibility and are aware that their website is not accessible. And I don't know if you all know that we're getting a new website in the fall, August through November, and I'm sure that it's going to be a priority for them.
Thanks, Laura. Okay, where does that leave us for today? You know, obviously we have talked a lot about, you know, accessibility with materials, information, participation, that kind of thing. We've talked about addressing equity more generally speaking, and kind of where we as a subcommittee go from here. I'm just kind of trying to navigate the rest of the time that we have. Vicky, I see your hand up. So I'll go to you, Vicky, and then maybe depending on where we go after your comments, we can kind of circle back and see kind of what our action items are at this point, and try and regroup a little bit with our discussion and all the things we've been talking about. So yeah, go ahead, Vicky.
I was just wondering about how best to frame this, but in terms of looking at those broader equity issues, and you know, and I know like my focus often tends to be on accessibility because that's the world that I'm in, but I don't know how many of you are familiar with the universal design principles. I know Jay, you are. And I know Liz is, because Liz and I've talked about this, and I'm almost wondering if that's the way to frame it, and not just it, because accessibility becomes a part of it. But there's 7 principles of universal design, which I won't remember all of them just off the top of my head. I have memory issues, so I need to look at it. And so those originally came up for physical, you know, architecture, but have been adapted to like education and programs. And the whole idea is to think about all the people that would use like a building or a program or whatever it is, and you build it for all of them, or design it so that you know, you don't have to provide then modifications of policies and procedures, or you know, you take into account like race and age and disabilities and culture, and you know, and it's hard to tackle all of them, but if you follow those 7 principles, it helps to do that. And then it means that, you know, because being equitable and accessible is more than, I always talk about, like, you can make a building physically accessible, but that doesn't mean that once disabled people get in, they truly have the opportunity to fully participate, because there are other, you know, so many other issues that intersect with that. And so I don't know, it's just a thought, because I really think that's what we're talking about. Like that's the whole idea behind universal design, is trying to get at equity. And so you can, like I said, there are 2 versions of it. And in fact, we've adapted it for our center. For anything that we develop, we have a checklist for any materials or training that we do. And we've done some training with other nonprofits and help them, you know, brainstorm. And so it's kind of like, if you look at, okay, there's the ADA. The ADA is focused, and also the Rehab Act, Section 504, because anybody getting federal funding has to follow Section 504. It's all focused on barrier removal, because assuming like there are barriers in the environment and with programs, and so it's all about how to remove the barriers. Whereas universal design is, let's look at it broader and design things without the barriers to begin with. And so if we had a society that was designed according to those principles, we wouldn't need the ADA, because we wouldn't have those barriers to the environment and programs, you know, in the first place, at least for people with disabilities. Anyway, I know we're running over, so that was just, as you were saying, where do we go with it? I'm just thinking that maybe approaching it from that universal design, the principles, and I'm happy to pull some things and share with everybody, but that might help, because I drill it into my staff's head all the time. It's like, well, okay, so now it's accessible for our peeps, but let's, you know, there's more people, so let's go broader and think about. And it's like, it's so much easier. It's like, yes, you spend a little bit more time, you know, when you're designing something, but then once you implement it, you're not constantly doing damage control or spending money to fix something. And so that's the way we kind of approach things. Like, let's just figure out how to make it as universally accessible, to everyone, not just from a disability perspective, but for all users.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Vicky. And we're actually not really running short on time. This is our main kind of time for discussion. And after this, we really only have a couple more items. One's call to the audience, and that's Joe. So he's here talking already. So we probably won't need time for that. And then we've got next steps, items for future meetings. So we've definitely got some time here to keep talking. So yeah, Ernesto, go ahead.
Jay, and members, I'm going to drop out. I believe the meeting should continue. Laura is co-host. I have a 2 o'clock meeting. If the meeting does stop because I started it, Laura can quickly restart it. So if this is a good time, we can test it.
Okay, yeah. So if we get kicked off, Laura will restart, and then we'll all go back to the same meeting link and just jump back in.
Ernesto, it should prompt you when you say to leave. It'll ask you if you want to end the meeting for all or to assign the host to somebody else. And then you can pick Laura.
Okay, so let's try that. Thank you, Vicky. And thank you for the discussion today.
We're still here. Yay. All right. So again, I'm not trying to quash the conversation if there are things that we want to keep rolling with, but I do want to just take a minute to kind of circle back and see, based on our conversation, what, if any, items for action we want to take back to the full commission at this point. Again, we can keep going as for longer, but obviously we have talked about accessibility in a number of different facets, from as narrow as the commission's work to HCD to the city at large, internal bureaucracy, and then moving even further out as the city and the commission does work that affects the larger community. So I definitely think that that's something that I would propose that we take to the larger commission and propose. I don't know exactly what the action would be, but that action be taken to make sure that, at least starting with the work that we're doing as the commission, is fully accessible and meeting all applicable laws, and then really taking it a step further and thinking about participation and making sure that what we're doing is available to the widest, really to everybody, not just the widest, but to everyone who wants to participate. So that's one piece of the puzzle, I think, in terms of action items. Just trying to think what else we have in terms of kind of what we want to take back. Obviously, I can talk about the things that we have been discussing in terms of what a potential study would look like, addressing equity. Joe, you brought up the idea of data. I think we didn't talk about that a whole lot more after you brought it up, but again, I think it kind of goes back to our larger conversation, right? If we don't all have the data, or some people are using data that not everybody has, that in and of itself is an equity issue, and essentially limits participation even within the commission, which I think goes back to our larger conversation of what's our baseline, what's our data, what are the actual equity issues, what is the data showing that are the equity issues, so that we can actually work to address them. So I think that that's a piece of kind of what I would suggest that be taken back to the full commission. Are there any other kind of main points or ideas that we want to take back to the full commission? And are there any other kind of action items that we're wanting to take back to the full commission?
Well, I have one, and
Yeah.
this just came out of today's conversation. I personally think it would be a great idea for the entire commission to be informed about universal design. I was clicking around after Vicky brought it up. And, you know, as usual, there's a lot more reading I want to do. And if I haven't thought about it, I don't think, I believe there are probably other members of the commission who haven't considered it as well. And I think it's very important that we do when we talk about development.
Yeah, great. I just wrote it down and put it on our list. Vicky.
I was just going to say, I put two resources that give a good overview in the chat too.
Great, thanks, Vicky. What else am I missing? What else do we want to take back to the full commission? Any action items that we need to take back? Yeah, Joe.
I know one of the things we've mentioned as an idea that almost doesn't really have a home right now is tenant protection. And I don't, again, does that it overlaps with segregation and it overlaps with housing affordability for sure. And neither group has taken up a really substantive look and discussion at what best practice tenant protections are, what we can recommend to mayor and council, what we can do in the state of Arizona, and what we would recommend, you know, that would need some other changes, like, you know, at a state legislative change, things like that. So I don't know if that's, I just never know, because is that something housing segregation wants to bring to the CEHD? When you kind of pushed all the work out to subcommittees, the ones that aren't stuff that's not explicitly defined as, oh yeah, that's definitely one subcommittee or another, sometimes gets lost. And I think the tenant protections are just the absolute vanguard of housing equity.
Right.
And we said last time we're kind of missing the mark on some of those things. And I think that's
Hey,
Yeah.
Joe, hang on to that thought. Hang on to that, because there's something I want to mention that I see before what you brought up, but I you know, I do see the importance of what you mentioned, because something's been weighing on my soul for the past days and weeks. I've been out distributing flyers about an expungement clinic and stuff like that, and I went out to some properties, which they're very substandard. And some of the issues are that these particular properties are the only properties that will rent to people who have criminal records. And if these places don't exist, these people don't have anywhere to go to. At the same time, we, the city, are allowing these environments to exist. And man, I walked through them, and they're just dangerous for everybody involved. Those living there, people who visit there, but the danger of addressing it harshly, firmly, let's say, would be that now these people have no place to go. So like Joe, my thoughts about this particular subject or subsubject, to me, it's a part of segregation, to me, as well as affordability. Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, I think you're completely right, and this is another thing that I don't think has found its way into the CEHD at any point. And I get your concern that, you know, for something like one of the recent experiences that sticks in my mind is the Monterey Gardens out on the east side, right? And listening to people who live there say, hey, this is a majority of the people who live there are below the poverty line or on housing choice vouchers or disabled, and sometimes overlap between all three of those. And this is a place that had one bedrooms for $840 a month got sold, and they're $1,225 a month. Like, you want to keep those properties. If you've got something that's in the realm of naturally occurring affordable housing, you want to keep that. But you also want to make sure that standards are upheld. And what we hear from Arizona multi-housing at every point where you try to bring up some kind of rule to make housing better for people is that, well, that means fewer places will want to do it. You know, oh, source of income protection. Yeah, we'll just raise the rates so that people who have housing choice vouchers can't get that, and people on SSDI won't be able to get into anywhere. And that's really frustrating. Specifically talking about some of the stuff that you're talking about, one of the organizations I've been curious about that was recently going through a transition was Just Communities Arizona. And they were formerly a branch of the American Friends Service Committee, the AFSC, which is, kind of an expressly abolitionist organization and deals with a lot of concerns, not just with the prison industrial complex, but people who also have issues after release, and I haven't seen them get into housing a bunch, but in working with like the Barrio Neighborhood Coalition, I'm really interested in their thoughts on that, because I think that lots of people do have issues in the housing sphere because of a past criminal record too. And I know there are kind of ban the box kind of laws around employment and around housing, and I'm not sure if that fixes all of the issues even. That's one that I need to know more about. And I wonder who's got the info.
Yeah, I just wanted to tag on to what Joe was saying, Jay. I've said what was on my mind, for a while, but I just didn't know how do we, again, in my view, it's a part of segregation because they're segregating this population in these areas because they can't go anywhere else.
Yeah, well, I mean, Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, I mean, just the title alone, right? I mean, that's exactly what the prison industrial complex is, and it does, right? I mean, if the percentage of folks that are incarcerated and then the issues that they have coming out of the system to find housing, I mean, it's working exactly as Jim Crow did, just without the explicit laws, segregating people by race. So it's clearly an issue. And I mean, again, I think you guys are hitting on what I feel like is what our role on this subcommittee is turning into, which is actually reminding the commission about the equity issues that we're supposed to be dealing with. And then I just think it goes back to what we have concluded here as a subcommission at this point, which is a subcommittee at this point, which is what are the baselines, right? I mean, what is the thing that we can point to aside from saying, oh, we know that there's a lot of substandard housing in this community, and it's generally for people that are getting out of the system, and those people are generally people of color, and that's an equity issue. Aside from our anecdotal conversations that we have, we know this to be true. In order for us to move forward and start to tackle these issues and come up with solution and action items, we need a baseline, because this is what happens every time. We know that this is going on, we talk about it, but I feel like because it's not been studied, and I hate to use that phrase because it can be so dry and dusty, but we've got to have something that we can springboard from and say, this is my feeling. In these census tracts in Tucson, you see X, Y, and Z. There's this much substandard housing. This is where people with criminal backgrounds are residing. This is where the evictions are high. And if we don't have that, I just feel like it's really difficult then to come around and say, okay, city, here are the problem areas. Here are the equity issues. These are the things that we think should be done about it, because I just feel like we end up spinning our wheels. So I am with all of you guys and gals, and the idea of tenant protection, substandard housing, criminal history, how that relates to segregation, I think is all right on. And I guess I would just come back and ask again, based on where we are with this conversation and thinking about identifying these issues, is that not encompassed and encapsulated in kind of what we've already put before the commission as a whole? Or do we want to come back and, have an addendum for the next commission meeting and say, this is what we brought last time, the idea of doing a study and a baseline, and then, here's some other things we talked about and thought about last meeting that we want to add? Or are we kind of good with where we are? Again, just trying to tease out, is there an action item, a specific action item that we want to bring forth to the commission, or are we still kind of in a good spot with, our summary and kind of what we've talked about so far? Laura?
Laura's got a hand up here.
I put this in the chat, but I've been doing this research on the CUNY Institute for State and Local Governments Equity Indicator Project, where they worked with 6 cities across the country: Dallas, New York, Philadelphia, St. Louis. And what it does is it identifies equity indicators where there is clear data, that the city has access to that can be measured on an annual basis. And it says, this is where we stand today. This is, like you're saying, this is the baseline. And now we have a very clear metric that we can measure progress. And there's a lot of research and documentation on the internet that I think could be a really good guide for something that, the city might be able to do. And it might be something that, because it is equity broadly, it might be something that we can work with the equity office, to encourage them to participate, or, recommend that be something that they work on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's great. Thanks for sharing, Laura. And I also feel like this is exactly what the equity office and the chief equity officer, this is what that position to me is all about. So, I mean, again, the fact that not much has been said about that position up to this point. And, again, I would think that our commission would be one of the first stops that director would make. And I would hope that next commission meeting, that person is there. I don't know, maybe that's another thing that we could recommend or ask for, is that the, chief equity officer pay us a visit. Again, the fact that we would have to ask for that to happen is a little bit strange, but it is what it is. So
I do know that we had a meeting scheduled with her, and she didn't come to the meeting. And then, but also they have 2 openings right now. So I know that they're expanding that office out. So it's Burgess right now.
yeah.
But I know they're hiring 2 more people. So we might see more action on that soon.
Great. Thanks for the update there.
She was at the IID stakeholder thing. I think I saw her there. Well, you're bringing up CUNY, by the way. One of my favorite peoples there in the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics is Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and she's coming out with 2 books this year, hopefully. But one of the things she talks about is employment discrimination, and when you add together, just for the U.S., people who are undocumented, and then people who have a criminal record being effectively not documented, being documented to not work, that's actually most of the potential U.S. workforce is either undocumented or documented not to work. And if you're using the same guidelines for housing as you are for employment, that means those people are going to have trouble finding housing, and they're going to be limited somewhere, and that's a segregation issue too.
Absolutely. Also, I took part or listened to a webinar this morning by the NYU Furman Center about exploring legal frameworks for addressing racial disparities in housing. Also, one of the panelists was Kristen Maun, M-A-U-N, and is the Director of Housing Development and Incentives for the Tulsa Authority of Economic Opportunity. So she was talking about a number of things that they were doing in Tulsa, trying to look at policies through an equity lens as well. So, I mean, again, I think that that's the other thing to me, is that there is a lot of work going on out in other cities and communities that Tucson could draw from. And what they were talking about this morning was more of like an equity audit. And I think that that's, again, kind of what we're talking about for the city, right? It's like the city bureaucracy needs an equity audit. And so do the policies and practices that are out that are affecting the city and the way that the city is dealing with housing and community development. So maybe it's less of a study and more of an audit. I mean, it might just be splitting hairs and parsing terms there, but I think there are definitely examples of cities and communities that have already done this. Yeah, go ahead, Vicki. You muted.
Sorry.
Vicki, you muted again.
Sorry. I said I just put another resource in the chat. You all might be familiar with it, but I get a lot of good information from there. But I noticed the study that Laura shared, or was at St. Louis, it looks like the United Way partnered with them. And our local United Way has a whole financial stability partnership. I'm just throwing that out, or no, now it's called financial wellness. They keep changing the name. And it just seemed like, if there needed to be a bigger collaboration that really fits with their focus as well. And I'll be honest, I used to participate in that partnership, but I got tired of it. Just repeats the same thing over and over again. And so it kind of stood out when I saw what Laura shared, like this could be a really great project, community wide. Anyway.
Well,
but,
oh, sorry.
sorry.
No,
well, and I was going to say, you said, what next? I feel like we need an answer. Like, is there going to be a study or some way to identify those benchmarks? Because if not, then what?
Right. Then what are we doing?
Right.
Kind of is my question. No, I'm not bitter, and I'm not really trying to call the United Way out, but they did not support the Fight for 15. So their equity bona fides, in my opinion, are not great. So maybe they can turn their ship around, though.
Oh, well, yeah. And like I said, I haven't been participating because it just grew old, but.
But they're always welcome at the table. I'd love to have them support the equity movement. So anyway. All right, guys, what else?
Well, before we wrap this up and move on to something else, I just wanted to say that, I mentioned, because I brought up what I did because of my experience, like I said, past few days, few weeks. And I became a little concerned about my view / our view. And I mean, everybody's view. Commission on Equitable Housing and Development. I wonder if we're looking at like the middle class, or we don't view enough from the middle class down. Because when I think about our commission, I don't necessarily think about the people I visited. They were like an afterthought. And I was like, wait, they do exist. They're here, and they need to be a part of this conversation. We're talking about housing, we're talking about affordable housing, and that's great. But there's these other people that, again, my view, if we're not careful, we're going to put them on the street, and then we're going to wind up picking them up off the street because we put them there, so to speak. So I know we need to do something. We need to do something that doesn't hurt them. Now, I don't know what the answer is. I honestly don't. But I wanted to try to speak on their behalf.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Mike. That makes sense. Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
That's my biggest conception generally in all of this. I know I come to all the housing segregation subcommittee meetings, but the biggest correlation between even homelessness and anything else isn't mental health, drug use, or anything else. It's housing cost.
Yeah, affordable housing.
And we see what gets built, when we look at a lot of kind of the more stressed places are where more data is coming out of. So San Francisco is a pretty good one, where you see what's getting built. And you see that there's a really high percentage of housing that gets built that isn't for affordable, that's just market rate housing. And that's one of my concerns when we bring up zoning changes and we bring up deregulation, is that what we're going to do is make things easier for market rate development that doesn't focus on equity, that doesn't focus on affordability, and that, you know, there's kind of this conception that, oh, that was another thing in that meeting from affordable housing I was talking about, was the freaking chair of the CEHD said, well, are you saying if we just make it easier, everything trickles down? And the actual answer to that was, well, yeah, I remember that from my microeconomic textbook 30 years ago. And it drives me up the wall, because we know that in a globalized, hyper-commodified, financialized housing market, that isn't how it works. And like, you know, I think I put a study in there. It was data out of Canada. It's like 33 metropolitan areas that just in general outbuilt their household growth over a 15, 16-year period. And there wasn't a correlation of it stabilizing or lowering rents. It kept going. Vancouver's was the worst. They outbuilt by household growth by 20%, right? But there was no eye to equity or affordability, and the housing prices went up 6 times as much as wages in that time span. Like, we're not building affordable housing, we're not acquiring affordable housing at the kind of rate we need to. I have concerns about, okay, so we're going to try to, even if you try to market rate and affordable outbuild this, when you start doing that, I have sustainability concerns, because the building industry is such a carbon intensive one. Yeah, I feel like I'm concerned about the loss of a focus on equity, and making sure we're getting not just more housing units, but the housing units that are deeply affordable, 50, 60%, 25% AMI, wherever we need them. And not just, well, we've got more units and we're going to wait for the trickle down. Because the data I saw, the best data I've seen on filtering, I think, is that you're gonna beat inflation at best by 2.2% per year. So if you're looking at something like the Flynn or the Monier or the Benedictine or the Rendezvous, where you're talking about $1,500 or $1,600 a month rents for 1 bedroom, okay, is it going to be 15 or 20 years? At some point, are they going to renovate? Are they going to reposition like the Cadence, which went from student to market rate and gets back to the top of the market? These are all concerns that I have about that chunk of it. Sorry to go on about it, Vicki. I saw your hands up.
I actually have to get off. I have an overlapping meeting, but I just wanted to follow up with that. I was just thinking about, unless we get kind of solid data to work with, those of us who are providing direct services, you know, have those scenarios all the time. And I know I said I was very negative about some things going on, like with government as a whole, but I do want to say my center has city funding, and we have a really great partnership with the CD staff. And I mean, frankly, I just redo all their forms, and they've been good about it. I've revised every form, rewritten them, because I've pushed back. It's like, what does this even mean? People aren't going to understand this, and this isn't accessible. And I mean, it's been a process, but we've gotten them to a better place, and then they've even shared them with other grantees to use. So I do want to say, you know, that change happens slowly. But with that, I mean, our funding is to do home modifications. And I was thinking about just one of the struggles that we sometimes have is when we go to do the environmental assessment, like people will call and say, well, I need a ramp, or I need, want my tub turned into a roll-in shower. And then we get there and the house is literally falling down around them, and there have been times, I mean, I will say the department's really worked with us. We've been able to, work with the programs that are doing like home repairs, but, my liaison a couple of times, he's like, Vicki, you just have to recognize sometimes we have to walk away. And I'm like, yeah, but walking away means they're going to be homeless in, like a month, because like they didn't even call us about all the repairs. They need a ramp to get in and out of their home. That like, and if we can't even do that, that, I mean, they literally can't get in and out of their home, where they can't take a shower or get into the bathroom or wherever it is. And it's like we struggle with that every day, anyway, I know all of that, but I think I always say, like, when it comes to these issues and getting others to understand what it's really like, I really like them to go out with the programs that are doing direct services and working with homeless people, and, to go out and do a day in the life and see what it's really like. So, but I do have to jump off. I'm sorry. And thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Vicki. So yeah, I mean, again, I think we're kind of discussing a lot of the more granular issues, equity issues that we're seeing in the community, and needing to amplify those things. And Joe, I share your concern. I mean, on the one hand, I totally get it, right? It's like, more building is better than no building, right? There is that. But if we are not intentional about making our development and our housing more equitable, it's not going to be, because the system that we are operating in is not equitable, and still is has a very strong whiff of the racist policies that were around years ago that created our housing pattern. So if we don't actually do anything, and we go from crisis to crisis. I feel like the foreclosure crisis is another great example, right? It's like, it was devastating. The federal government stepped in a pretty major way to prop up the system. But once that recovery started, and it just wasn't an equitable recovery. It was just like, oh, we got to throw money at it, and it's a crisis, and we're just going to do the best we can. And I feel like, fast forward to today, it's what, 15, almost 20 years later, and we're in that same kind of situation where it's like, oh, well, it's a crisis again, so we're just going to do the best we can, and we can't do a whole lot. And, equity is the first thing that goes out the window. And then fast forward 10 more years, we'll be in a new crisis, and we still won't have addressed equity because we're moving from crisis to crisis. So I'm with you. And I think that that's another thing that's kind of coming in loud and clear to me, that I will certainly take to the full commission. I don't know if it's an action item per se, but that we're concerned about all of these equity issues that essentially are still, we're really not addressing. And, the affordable housing thing, and looking at barriers to building is clearly important, but all of these things we've talked about, I mean, we spent over an hour today talking about various equity issues that we're seeing that essentially aren't getting addressed, and that I think as a commission, we are struggling with how to address. So that's another big takeaway, I think, for me, that I will talk about when I give the summary of our meeting. And I would also encourage, any of you that are there at the next commission meeting, obviously I'll do my best to explain and try and draw out some of the action items. But if I miss anything, or if anybody has anything to add, I'm more than happy to share that stage with anybody else on the commission. So we are getting close. We've got about 6 minutes until our stopping time of 2:30. So with y'all's permission, I will move along to the next agenda item, it shouldn't take too long. If there are any final kind of things to wrap up our conversation, I will entertain that as well, but do need to move on to the other agenda items. Mike, Joe, what do y'all think? Cool. All right. Number 4, call to the audience. This is the time when any member of the public may address the Commission on Equitable Housing and Development. Due to time constraints, the total time allocated for this is 15 minutes. Individuals are allowed 3 minutes each. Due to open meeting law, commission members cannot discuss topics that are not on the agenda. Items brought up by the public may be considered as an agenda item for a future meeting. Call to the audience. All right.
Jay, good job
Yeah.
at the Fair Housing Town Hall last week.
Say that again. I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Good job at the Fair Housing Town Hall.
Oh, thank you.
That's
Appreciate
all.
that. Appreciate that. Number 5, next steps. I see on the agenda, our next meeting is May 26th at 1 p.m. Any items for future meetings? I mean, under our agenda, under number 3, ideas for action, review equity topics. I mean, we've got a huge latitude there to basically, I think, talk about kind of whatever we want. So I'm certainly happy to entertain items for future meetings if we want to put a pin in something. But again, I think we have a lot of latitude here. So any items for future meetings?
I've got nothing solid at this time.
That's kind of where I am, Mike. Joe, you got anything?
I got a bunch of notes, but you know.
No, you're right. You're right. We can talk about almost anything we need to under that heading, and yeah, like you said, that gives us latitude, and I think we just talked about anything else I would want to bring up. So it's just continuing that conversation, as our mayor would say.
Right. Cool. Well, with that, I would like to thank everybody for coming to the meeting today and having yet another very productive conversation. And I will see most of you, I think, at the full commission meeting. And if not, I hope to see you at the next Housing Segregation Subcommittee meeting on May 26th. And with that, I will bid everyone farewell.
Bye.
Thank you all.
See ya.